Canada and the US both have their own major budget stories going on, and the entire world is waiting to hear what happens with the Supreme Court case, what that means for trade moving forward.
It's official. Canada, the country once praised for its stability, is running out of money. The new 2025 federal budget has shattered every illusion of economic control. A $78 billion deficit, equal to 2.5% of our entire GDP, has just been unveiled. And the warning bells aren't coming from the opposition this time. They're coming from inside the government itself. Prime Minister Mark Carney, the man who promised financial discipline and global respect, is now standing before Canadians saying something no leader has dared to say in decades: we can't afford this anymore.
We will build here at home stronger industries, nation-building infrastructures, and millions of more homes for Canadians. We will protect what matters most: our people, our communities, and our sovereignty.
Interest payments on our national debt are now outpacing the deficit itself, meaning Canada spends more just servicing its loans than it does actually fixing its problems. And as Ottawa braces for tax hikes, spending cuts, and angry protests, the truth is dawning on every Canadian family. The nation's wallet is empty. So how did we get here? How did the country that once balanced budgets under Chrétien and Harper become a sinking ship under Carney? Let's break it down. For decades, Canada prided itself on being the cautious economy, steady, moderate, and immune to the chaos that rocked the US and Europe. But those days are gone. The 2025 budget reveals a deficit of nearly 78 billion Canadian dollars, the largest since the pandemic era. What's worse, this isn't a crisis year. There's no global emergency. This is just normal governance. Ottawa is spending like it's 2020 again, but without the excuse. The Royal Bank of Canada issued a warning that reads more like a post-mortem. Canada's fiscal outlook is deteriorating rapidly, with no credible plan for balance. Let's put that into perspective. Every single Canadian, from newborn to retiree, now carries over $32,000 of federal debt. And that number is climbing faster than wages, faster than GDP, and faster than the government can explain it away. Much of this shortfall comes from bloated programs, corporate subsidies, and political pet projects, policies designed for short-term applause, not long-term survival. Billions have been poured into green initiatives with little oversight. Billions more into bureaucratic expansion that produces no measurable output. And while the spending spree continues, tax revenue is flattening.
However, we're seeing a major tale of two cities here, because assuming the US budget is approved, it means the US will take off and see major positive momentum moving forward. Whereas if the Canadian one gets passed, 2026 has the potential to be the worst year in Canadian history.
Canada's productivity has fallen to its lowest level in 2 decades, and foreign investment, once our lifeblood, has slowed dramatically. The government calls it fiscal flexibility. Economists call it what it is when a financial malpractice. Mark Carney, the man who built his career on caution, now faces the reality that under his leadership, Canada has become addicted to debt, and the withdrawal symptoms are going to be brutal. Here's where it gets terrifying. Canada's interest payments, the cost of simply maintaining our debt, are now projected to exceed the entire annual deficit itself. Let that sink in. We're not just borrowing money. We're borrowing to pay for the interest on the money we already owe. According to the Hub, the federal government is expected to spend 85 billion Canadian dollars per year on interest payments alone within the next 3 years. That's more than the combined budgets for health transfers, infrastructure, and national defense. We've crossed into what economists call a debt feedback loop, where debt itself becomes the single largest government expense. Once that happens, fiscal independence starts to erode. Foreign creditors, investors from the US, China, and Europe, begin to dictate terms. The Bank of Canada, forced to buy back government bonds to prevent a collapse, prints more money, which drives inflation, which drives up rates, which drives up interest payments again. It's a vicious cycle, and Carney knows it. This is a man who once warned the UK about the silent killer of fiscal overreach. Now he's watching it unfold at home. When questioned during a press conference about rising interest costs, Carney reportedly paused for several seconds before replying, "We all need to understand that this will require sacrifice."
So what's been made of this first budget under a Mark Carney government and these so-called generational investments? Will they kickstart Canada's economy? I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it all down tonight. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, good to see you all a second time today.
That word, sacrifice, has become the centerpiece of the 2025 budget. Ottawa is preparing Canadians for what's next: higher taxes, fewer services, and austerity without a plan. This is not the Canada our parents knew. It's a country financing its future by mortgaging its soul. Inside Ottawa, a political earthquake is shaking the Liberal Party to its core. The 2025 budget didn't just expose a deficit, it exposed a deep civil war within Carney's own ranks. According to senior insiders, the moment the final budget draft hit Carney's desk, his patience finally cracked. For weeks, he'd been pushing his cabinet to scale back spending, to show restraint, to start treating the deficit like the emergency it truly is. But instead of backing him, his own ministers resisted, addicted to political popularity, terrified of losing votes. One insider described the scene. Carney slammed his pen on the table and said, "We can't keep buying applause with borrowed money." The room went silent. For a man known for his calm, it was a moment of rare fury, a sign that even he now understood the monster his party had created. What followed was chaos. Finance officials split into factions: the realists, led by Carney and Deputy Finance Minister Sarah Lee, pushing for immediate spending cuts, and the legacy loyalists, clinging to Trudeau-era populism, demanding more subsidies, more grants, more vote-winning programs. The clash was ideological and generational. Carney's faction wanted a reset, fiscal responsibility, balanced growth, a return to credibility. But the old guard, still nostalgic for the post-COVID stimulus boom, accused him of betrayal. "You're abandoning liberal values," one minister shouted during a closed-door meeting. Carney's response was cold. Liberal values don't mean fiscal suicide. Behind the scenes, it's said that several MPS walked out. Some began leaking to the press, painting Carney as elitist and tone-deaf to working Canadians. But outside the political bubble, Canadians weren't angry at Carney's tone. They were furious that it took this long for anyone in Ottawa to tell the truth. The irony is painful. Mark Carney, the global face of financial stability, the man who lectured Europe on prudence, is now trapped in a government built on overspending and denial. His expertise, once his greatest weapon, has become his prison. And that's the tragedy. The very man who could save Canada's economy is surrounded by a political class unwilling to let him try. He's not fighting the Conservatives. He's not fighting Trump. He's fighting his own government, his own people, just to stop the bleeding. And every day he delays decisive action, the debt grows, the deficit widens, and Canada's reputation sinks further into the red. The question haunting Ottawa now isn't whether Carney will fix this. It's whether he'll even survive it. When Mark Carney stood at that podium and told Canadians to prepare for sacrifice, the country went silent. Because behind that single word, sacrifice, lies the harshest truth of all. The burden of Ottawa's failures will fall not on the politicians who caused them, but on the citizens who trusted them. This isn't just a budget story anymore. It's a national reckoning that's about to hit every household, every grocery cart, every gas tank, and every paycheck. The numbers may live in spreadsheets, but their consequences live in people's lives. Families across the nation are already feeling the squeeze. In Toronto, mortgage renewals are crushing middle-class homeowners. Interest rates pushing monthly payments up by over $1,000 in some cases.
I think that's when we are going to see the major announcements take place. And unfortunately, I gotta agree with Ron Butler today. We know I'm a certified Ron Butler hater, but he made a good point today. And included in the 2026 major announcements, Quebec is not only dancing around the fact that they want to leave anymore, it is now a stated goal from the federal party that they want Quebec to be its own country.
In Alberta, small business owners are laying off longtime employees because operating costs have become impossible to manage. In British Columbia, food bank lines stretch around city blocks. Parents are skipping meals so their children can eat. Retirees are taking part-time jobs at gas stations just to afford medication. And through it all, Ottawa insists this is temporary. Temporary, they said, when gas crossed $2 a liter. Temporary, they said, when grocery bills rose 20% in 2 years. But nothing about this feels temporary anymore. It feels permanent, a new reality built on political denial. The 2025 budget calls for modest increases in revenue, bureaucratic language for tax hikes, higher taxes on fuel, new digital levies, increased income thresholds. Even whispers of a national consumption tax have surfaced in policy circles. And yet, while the average Canadian will carry this burden, the same government continues to spend billions on non-essential projects, climate conferences, consultant fees, inflated public salaries, and endless transition funds that seem to transition nothing but public wealth into political vanity. Across Canada, a sense of betrayal is setting in. The people who built this country, workers, truckers, farmers, teachers, small business owners, feel abandoned by a leadership that talks about empathy while drafting austerity plans from marble offices. When Carney spoke about sacrifice, he framed it as a patriotic duty, a shared hardship for the greater good. But in reality, the scales aren't balanced. The elite in Ottawa will barely feel a tremor, while the working class braces for an earthquake. The sacrifice he speaks of will not come from political pensions or corporate boardrooms. It will come from single mothers juggling rent, from seniors choosing between heat and food, from nurses working overtime as hospitals face cuts. And that's the unbearable irony. Carney rose to power promising stability, yet under his leadership, instability has become the new norm. Canadians are sacrificing not for progress, but for survival. When governments overspend, they don't just bankrupt the Treasury, they bankrupt trust. And trust, once gone, doesn't come back with another budget speech. As the dust settles over this so-called fiscal correction, one thing is clear. The era of sacrifice has begun. And it's the people, not the politicians, who will bleed for it. There's a quiet fear spreading across the country, a fear that Canada, once seen as the model of stability, has finally lost its footing. The numbers from Budget 2025 are more than financial data. They're a warning, a red flare in the night sky that says our way of life is no longer sustainable.
Let's start with the budget, then we'll talk about some of the political moves that have happened today. Andrew, what did you make of whether the budget delivered on what it promised to do, which is to transform the economy in a big way?
A deficit of 78 billion Canadian dollars isn't just a statistic. It's a mirror reflecting years of denial. It shows a nation living beyond its means, ruled by leaders addicted to spending, promising everything while delivering nothing. Canada's debt has now surpassed 1.4 trillion Canadian dollars, and interest payments are expected to exceed 85 billion Canadian dollars a year, more than the federal government spends on health or defense. What does that mean for the future? It means every new hospital, every school, every road, and every clean energy project must now compete for funding against the growing monster of debt interest. It means every dollar collected from taxpayers is being used not to build the country, but to maintain the illusion that it's still functioning. This is what economists call a fiscal death spiral, when a nation borrows not to invest, but simply to stay alive. Canada has entered that stage. The engine is running, but the tank is empty. And yet in Ottawa, the denial continues. Carney insists this is manageable. Finance officials use phrases like fiscal flexibility and temporary imbalance. But Canadians know better. We see the decline every day. Crumbling infrastructure, underfunded healthcare, shrinking wages, and skyrocketing living costs. The decline isn't theoretical. It's visible, measurable, and painful. But the real tragedy here isn't the money, it's the mindset. For decades, Canadians believed we were different, smarter, more cautious, more disciplined than our southern neighbors. We believed we could spend our way to compassion, tax our way to equality, and borrow our way to progress. That illusion is gone now. The numbers have stripped it bare. Foreign investors are quietly backing away from Canadian bonds. Credit agencies are issuing warnings. The Canadian dollar is weakening. We are no longer the safe bet of the Western world. We are a cautionary tale in the making. And what makes it worse is the symbolism of it all. This isn't just a financial collapse, it's a collapse of identity. A country that once stood as the picture of prudence now stands as a warning about what happens when leadership refuses to say no. Carney's promise of stability has turned into a paradox. To stabilize, he must now dismantle the very system his predecessors built, a system of spending, entitlements, and political comfort. It's not just policy reform, it's national surgery. And the longer he delays, the more the rot spreads. In truth, Budget 2025 is not just a deficit document, it's a eulogy. A farewell to the Canada that was responsible, productive, and proud. Now we're a nation on life support, run by leaders too afraid to pull the plug and too stubborn to admit that we've already flatlined. And as the red ink deepens, Canadians are asking the question their leaders refuse to answer. How much more can we afford to lose before we lose the country itself?
And to move the moon and the stars and 6 other things. I've never heard such hype in the run-up to an election in my life. It was going to be, generational and transformative, and at the same time it was going to involve sacrifices and difficult choices. And, at the end of the day, with the exception of the increase in health in defense spending, you could pretty much imagine the Justin Trudeau government delivering this same budget.